Hello and welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about movies, about music. We are here for the season 1 finale of Rock Docs. That's right, to talk about the 2000 film Bittersweet Motel, directed by future Oscar nominee Todd Phillips, about the seminal jam band Phish.
And we have the guy to talk to us about this movie. Special guest today, we have Rob Mitchum. You might know him from his excellent Grateful Dead podcast, 36 from the Vault, from his writing in Pitchfork, or from his Phish essays Substack. Rob, thanks for joining us, man.
Hey, super happy to be here. And I am always excited to talk about Phish. So yes, you've come to the right place.
Oh, that's right. And as always, I'm also joined by my co-host, David Lizerbram.
How's it going?
David, how are you doing, man? You ready? Are you ready to talk some Phish?
That's I came to play.
All right, good. And I am Andrew Keatts. If you are just catching this episode for the first time, follow us on Twitter at RockDocsPod. But otherwise, let's just get into this bad boy. Rob, maybe you could start us off with a little rundown. What is Bittersweet Motel, and maybe tell us a little bit about your relationship with it up to this point.
Absolutely. So Bittersweet Motel is a documentary about the band Phish. That Phish with a PH, if you haven't stumbled across them at any point, made by Todd Phillips, who at the time was, he had only made documentary films, was sort of a cult filmmaker, I would say, because the only movie that had come out was a movie called Hated about G.G. Allen. Have either of you seen Hated?
I've not. I understand Phish loved it, though.
Yes.
Phish were big fans, right?
And they hired him on the basis, even though Phish could not be a more different band than G.G. Allen. And I forget what crude name he had for his backing band, but
the Murder Junkies, I think.
That's right, the Murder Junkies. Not as crude as you would think, I guess. Actually, that sounds.
But what a woman pees in his mouth in that movie.
Yes, he I believe defecates on stage. He died somewhere between when they premiered it and when it came out. So they have footage of his dead body over the credits, apparently. It's not a movie I've seen or that I really care to see, to be honest.
No, thank you.
But it sounds like the kind of thing that Phish would probably watch on the tour bus. It had that sort of, cult, people trading dubbed VHSs to each other status back then. So anyway, so Phish hires this young up-and-coming filmmaker named Todd Phillips, who is not particularly a Phish fan, to follow them around in 1997 and 1998. Now, as I understand it, Andrew, you are the Phish fan, and David, you have dabbled but not gone fully into the world of Phish. So Andrew knows that 1997 and 1998, he could not have stumbled into a better time to follow the band Phish.
Primo time, right?
Exactly. Among Phish fans, 97 is probably considered to be the best year, though it's a little bit controversial, as everything is with Phish. Yeah. But definitely a transitional time for the band. They changed their sound, they changed their approach, and it's pretty much, you can argue whether it's the best year, but it's certainly the year that set them up for, 3 more decades and counting of creativity. So Todd Phillips here had a front row seat for this really exciting time in Phish, and he made this movie, which I saw when it came out. Very excited to see it. I was in college. College was sort of when I, fell in love with Phish, like a lot of people do. Saw it in Ann Arbor at the Michigan Theater, which is a very large movie palace and music venue. I don't remember how many people were there exactly, but definitely me and all my Phish buddies were there.
That's got to be like one of those old movie theaters that like the Dead used to play a lot in the early 70s.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Type of place. Yeah.
The Dead played there. Phish played there, of course, in 1994. I saw Trey on a solo tour there. So actually, I think I saw Trey solo there before I saw this movie there. So I remember liking it a lot in 2000. And part of it was the novelty of having pro shots film of Phish on stage, even though I had seen them probably like 20 times by then. I hadn't seen them as close up and intimately as you do in this movie. So I liked it very much. I think I watched it a lot on DVD for a couple of years after that. And then I kind of grew apart from Phish. I came back to them later in life. but I do not think I've seen this movie in about 20 years until I watched it for this podcast. So I have a lot of thoughts. It is not a treasured like yearly tradition for me to watch this. It is something that I haven't seen in a long time, which maybe tips my hand about how I feel about it a little bit, but we'll get there.
All right, yeah, we will get there. David, so we've alluded over the course of this season to the fact that you don't especially love Phish, but you saw them in 1996 prior to this film's being filmed. You saw them again in 2003?
I think that's correct.
Yeah, and so then but you had never seen this movie. Did you know of this movie? Were you aware that there was a Phish rock doc floating around?
I think I was very vaguely aware of this movie, but I don't remember when it came out or anything about it particularly. I've more or less always had friends who are Phish fans, and so accompanied them to a few shows, and certainly am familiar with the music to a the degree of a dabbler, but had no prior relationship with this film.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so all right, let's get one thing out of the way early. So this film is presented chronologically, but Phillips has taken some artistic license here about the order of events.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think this is sort of a knock on him early in his career. So between Hated and Bittersweet Motel, he made a movie called Frat House.
Yes, right.
Another one I haven't seen, and I think it's actually kind of hard to see because it was made for HBO, but HBO never ran it. One story is that they didn't get the right releases from the frat kids that they documented, so they couldn't run it. But the other complaint was that they staged scenes for it. So I think, this is the last documentary, Bittersweet Motel is the last documentary Todd Phillips made. He was making Road Trip at the same time, I believe, and then jumped into Old School and The Hangover and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think documentary filmmaking was really his thing. And so in the sense of being a journalist and not futzing with the details. So the way the movie is presented is Phish playing in upstate New York in fall 97, then going to Madison Square Garden for New Year's Eve, then going to Europe in early 98, and then going to a big festival, The Great Went, which actually happened in the summer of 1997. So
yes, so that's the first thing that happened. The conclusion happened first.
Yes,
exactly.
But from watching the movie, you'd have no idea about that. I mean, it just seems like these things are. This is literally the first I'm hearing of this.
Right. Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that Phish also played a very large festival in the exact same location in the summer of 1998. So so they could have very easily just gone on and filmed that, but they filmed the Went first and they went back around, which is fine. I mean, narratively, it makes sense to have the big 70,000 person festival be the climax of your film,
especially with the large fire that erupts in the crowd, which is a dramatic endpoint.
Right, a very good symbolic image to end the movie on. So Phish fans complain a lot, and I remember was one of the things they complained about. But yeah, coming at it from let's say a naive perspective, a normal person's perspective, it doesn't really make that much of a difference.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, speaking of Phish fans complaining a lot, I'm bearing down for what they're going to say to whatever it is I end up saying over the course of this episode, because a harsh lot from time to time. But
nobody hates Phish like Phish fans.
That's exactly right. So there is one other moment that's interesting in here, which is I think actually the first thing we see is them rehearsing, or what's described as rehearsing, which in terms of documents that I'm really glad that we have as a Phish fan, we basically, as far as it looks, we see them writing the song "Birds of a Feather."
Right. Which wouldn't have happened until spring 98, I believe. Spring 98.
The Birds of a Feather debuts during the famous Island Tour.
Yes.
Which happened in between New Year's Eve that we see here and them departing for Europe in 98. So we can gather most likely that rehearsal session happens basically in the middle of the events of this film.
All right, I'm going to jump in. I think we've established that there's a confusing timeline here.
Yes.
But what I want to do as the kind of outsider to this is just kind of like do a little thumbnail about what this movie is for those unfortunate souls who haven't seen it. And so, I mean, really what it is in some ways a conventional like band on tour documentary where there's, sporadic interviews with band members kind of caught in hotel rooms or, on the fly, interspersed with, performance footage from the various concerts. You don't really see a full song necessarily that I can think of, but they're fairly lengthy clips of the band performing various songs of theirs, as well as some covers, Rolling Stones and others. And then there's, the occasional man on the street interview with a fan outside of a show or people at the festival and things like that. And just kind of like a little bit of a slice of life footage of the band, cruising around in the van or in, getting off their private plane or in the hotel rooms, etc. Just, what life is like for a, fairly successful popular band on tour. Beyond that,
I would say, I would say that some of those man on the street interviews are maybe more essential and actually feel more like relevant content for Phish than they probably would for another band, just because like the lot scene is such a component of a typical Phish show. And so, taking a trip through the lot and talking to people who are buying nitrous balloons or, have their finger in the air trying to catch a ticket is, maybe more substantive than just, putting a mic in the face of somebody who's walking into a Rolling Stones concert.
Right. I hear that. And I think the first complaint I'm going to have about this movie, and I want to be really clear just at the outset, if I have issues with this movie, it is not because I am trying to dunk on the band. Just to be clear,
you're worried about getting double teamed here.
People can. Well, I can take it, and I can take it from over. But I want to just say the first thing is, at times Phillips seems to pose the question of like, why are people fans of this band? That's asked of both the band members themselves and fans. But that thread is never really followed through in any serious way. It just kind of is a thing that happens from time to time. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Andy, that like, in theory, you could really interrogate the question of the fandom and the scene around the shows and stuff like that. I just don't know that this movie really does that in any way that's really interesting or compelling.
Yeah, I was my overall comment about this movie, my capsule review was pretty similar to what you just said, David, which is that it seems like it's trying to be three movies in one in only about 80 minutes. It's a pretty short movie. And so I don't think it really succeeds at any of those three things. Like there's the concert film aspect, which I think is probably the weakest part of this. And part of that is not really Todd Phillips' fault because 80 minutes is like shorter than a one
Phish song
of a Phish show. In some cases, that's 2 or 3 songs. So the fact that he is trying to show a bunch of songs and ends up, showing parts of songs, editing songs, which is total sacrilege to a Phish fan. It just doesn't really capture. There's some really nice shots, I should say, but it doesn't really capture the feeling of being at a Phish show or what's great about a Phish show, I think. Not very deeply. And then the second movie is sort of like behind the scenes, what it's like to be Phish. What is their process? Which I find totally fascinating. But to somebody who wasn't a Phish super fan, I think would be kind of like, why do we care? It doesn't really give you the why should you care about this band elements, which I think is kind of what you were saying. And then there's the third part, which I think is actually most in line with what Todd Phillips has gone on to do and the themes of his work, which is profiling the fan culture around Phish. And I think if there is like a theme you could say about Todd Phillips movies, it's that he's kind of like an auteur of bro culture, right?
Yes.
And there's a significant aspect of bro-ness to the Phish scene. I mean, it's like people are pretending to be hippies from the 60s, but it also is a very bro-y scene. And there's a couple scenes in this movie that really capture that well. And I think almost the best movie would have been just for Todd Phillips to spend a lot of time with the kids in the lot. and sort of get at this whole world built up around Phish. I think he was more drawn to that than Phish themselves. And you can really tell that from the movie.
Yeah, I think that's all well said and true. And I mean, in terms of not really exploring the question of what Phish is and why people like it so much, even though, you know, the question, the movie definitely asks the question, like, why do people like this band so much? But they don't explain it at all. For instance, one word you'll not hear in this movie is improvisation.
Yeah.
There's no discussion of what it is that makes their music different than any other bands. And there's like second order or third order descriptions of like Trey on the defensive about why people don't like him or why critics give them a hard time. But again, there's no exploration of what it is that they're doing out there that makes people have such polarized reactions to the band.
Yeah, well, in addition to that, I mean, I guess I would say if there was a protagonist to this film, it's Trey, who's the guitar player and lead singer of the band. But mostly he's being a dick. So, I mean, it's fine when he's singing and playing the guitar, but when he's speaking or acting, he doesn't necessarily come off well. And I'm sure those are choices made by the director and editor, not, necessarily reflective of Trey's overall behavior and demeanor. And I understand the band is not a big fan of this movie, which we could certainly get into. Right. I mean, this movie has, as far as I would describe it, almost no arc. It has not really a beginning, middle, or end. It hardly has a middle. And I mean, I'm like, you're just watching. There's no real tension or conflict. There's nothing you're building towards or excited about, or you're wondering what's going to happen. It's just kind of stuff happening. I watched this movie twice recently, and I'm just like, where is the movie here?
Well, yeah, I don't know. Rob, do you have any thoughts on how Trey comes off? I know this is one area that I can say that my Phish fan crew often expresses remorse about how Trey comes off in this movie.
Well, I mentioned earlier that he caught the band at a very interesting time in their musical development, which maybe doesn't come totally across, given what he pulled from the movie or what he pulled from the live footage. It's also an interesting period for Phish because it's when they went from being a very straight-laced, nerdy, not sober, but like a pretty like tame band. In terms of like rock and roll lifestyle to like having a party on the road, basically. Like the thing that jumped out to me watching it this time is how much they're drinking, like the entire movie, like before shows, after shows, on the beach, during practice, like they always have a drink.
But no sex or drugs is seen. It's all drinking.
No, other than Trey miming a blowjob on Fishman behind an open door.
To Frankenstein, right?
Right, exactly. Or making fun of the film crew for thinking they were going to get laid. I mean, it does definitely show them what a bunch of dorks they were. And I like that about the movie. Like, it doesn't pretend these are cool rock and roll guys. But it's also catching them at a time where they were starting to sort of play act the rock and roll lifestyle a little more, and it eventually overtook them. Like, if for some reason he just kept following them for 3 more years, you would have your narrative arc that you want, and it would be dark. Because Phish got darker and darker as the decade went on, to the point where, roughly 10 years after this, Trey gets arrested with a car full of drugs and goes to drug court and gets sober, and now everything's happy. But anyway,
and then he wrote Rise Come Together.
But yeah, it's a very Trey focused movie, which is to its detriment, because one of the great things about Phish is that they are a very democratic 4-way band, and that's what's so wonderful about their music. But in this case, the other members of the band, I think, wanted nothing to do with this movie after a certain point. So he just kept talking to Trey, and Trey was at a point in his life where I think he was just angry and starting to get a little bit more aggressive, which worked in his favor musically, but maybe didn't come off so well on film.
He's angry, but he's also spends a lot of time talking about like how everything's chill and he's having a good time and he just loves music. It comes off very defensive.
Yeah, and he's still, to this day, every interview he gives is about, how they're all friends and they love each other and everything is so happy and everything is so great. But I think through those interviews, you can kind of see the darkness maybe creeping into the Phish world at this time, which is, pretty. That's part of what I like about it, and that they caught them at this moment in time.
Yeah. So I read an interview with Todd Phillips that was done by Brandon Wennard, who's a major player on Phish Twitter. And Phillips says that basically no one else is in the movie because, they weren't into it. It was more or less Trey's idea, and that over the course of the filming that became even more true. So, like the extent of what we get from Fishman is John Fishman, the drummer, is him opening a hotel door at 2 p.m. to reveal that he had basically just gone to bed and there would be no interview that day. Page sits for one interview alongside Trey, where he basically just repeats what Trey had just said.
Says 4 words, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, 4 words. Although that's after Trey says one of the more memorable
yes.
and odd comments from the movie, which is also a comment that I hear on Phish Tour a lot. People making fun of that reference to Pumping Iron with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then Mike Gordon appears. Oh, actually, I take that back. There is the scene in the kitchen where they're all hanging out for a little bit and they each talk a little bit. But really, the Mike Gordon's one moment is describing who Phish is to a European journalist.
Yeah. How is Phish?
Yeah. And so there's, so basically like all the background, to the extent that this movie is like a straightforward rock doc, any sort of narrative description about what Phish is, who they are, how they got to this point of being able to play 70,000 people in Limestone is dispensed with more or less in 2 scenes. One is Mike Gordon explaining in a very brief moment what makes them different and how they don't have radio hits and they got popular through word of mouth, and that's basically because every show is different. And then John Fishman tells an amusing anecdote about their first show. And that's it. That's like really all the background you get about that is supposed to carry you right up to the present moment. And then we're just, we're about to see them play at the War Memorial in Rochester.
I want to kind of zoom in on the middle part of the movie, to the extent that there is a middle, which is when Phish, the band, goes on tour in Europe, because we see them playing in Rochester, New York. I love this. The Rochester War Memorial Coliseum, which is just sounds like a chill place to see a show.
has made many an appearance on the 36 from the Vault podcast.
Yes, exactly. We have a saying that there must be like 20 war memorial coliseums in upstate New York.
Right. Yeah.
And our other theory is that jam bands play best in minor league hockey arenas, and I'm pretty sure that one is a minor league hockey arena. So yeah.
So San Diego is home to a minor league hockey arena where Phish played. That Dave saw them, and one of those songs from that night ended up on Alive One. So there you go.
You can hear me on an official Phish recording, politely applauding.
Yes.
So in the middle of the movie, Phish, then we see a title card that basically says, okay, now they're leaving on a tour to Europe where they'll be playing small clubs. You don't really get any kind of vibe of small clubs. At one place, they're playing a theater, which is not. Hey, I played in a lot of bands, and it wasn't a small club where they were playing, from my perspective. But that says smaller venues than they would play in the U.S. But so you see them in Europe, and I was like, all right, this is gonna be interesting. You're gonna get them in a different context. These are young men who are smart, educated people who are going to go to Europe, and they're trying to find a fan base, and there was a narrative that seemed to be like right in front of you. It never pays off. You really don't see them at all engaging with being in Europe. I mean, you don't see them engaging with the culture or the music or the food or anything. Really, I mean, at one point you see them on a beach, and Trey is kind of acting a little bit like a jerk to the fans by not complying with their photography requests, which we could talk about. And then the only other thing you really see is they're in this antique shop, and Trey is pretending to negotiate to buy an antique Magnum gun. And he's waving this gun around and pointing it and pretending to be, a movie tough guy. It's from the perspective of now, I think just seeing a guy not using firearms discipline is sort of terrifying and really off-putting. It's clear he's just messing with the guy. He has no intention of buying this gun.
So I think he was considering buying the gun. I think he was. Yeah,
we can debate that, but nonetheless, I mean, that's really the only thing you see is him haggling and negotiating on the price of this vintage firearm with some guy in some store. And other than that, there's nothing about really their experience in Europe that would be other than that. It just could have been in, name your hockey arena USA. Or did I miss something there?
No, I mean, I think you're right. The gun scene, I agree, made me very queasy this time around. I don't remember how I responded to it originally. And you can tell that I think Todd Phillips loved this, like, let's put these hippie guys in a gun shop sort of juxtaposition. And it's kind of a funny scene, but it's very awkward. I did enjoy that he bought a whip and runs out into the street and whips the sidewalk, which is a very enjoyable Trey moment.
That was good times.
Yeah, but you're right. So, if I was making a Phish movie, for one, nobody would like it except other Phish fans. So it would make, $10,000 and disappear from theaters immediately. But what you would use the Europe sequence for is to talk about this transformation that they're going through, right? So
yeah. The time has come to do this. Well, let's dig into what the transformation that he has a camera there for that we don't get to see or talk about, really.
Yeah, I mean, so you take it. I want to hear your perspective on this first.
All right. So in '97, basically, more or less in fall '97, Phish started what fans refer to as the cow funk era. And this was a change in their sound and a change in their approach from where they had been over the previous years. And it was a much more relaxed sound. I don't know, Rob, you're a better rock writer than I am. How would you describe the cow funk sound? Well,
so it is definitely based on funk, the genre, though. And there is a classic line in this movie from the Great When sequence that describes it perfectly, which is Trey saying, "We sounded like James Brown's band on its worst night." Out there. So it was a sort of self-aware, because it sounds awful to think of for guys from Vermont, white guys from Vermont playing funk, but they were very self-aware about it. And what is important is that they took away from funk the idea that the idea that it's everybody in the band contributing equally, that it's a focus on texture and repetition and groove and danceability instead of big guitar solos, complicated arrangements, all the things that Phish had really done up until that point. So when I say they reinvented their sound during this period, that's really what happened. And it opened up all new vistas of improvisation for them, which sort of what started with funk, but moved quickly into ambience and, sort of more spacey rock music rather than just sticking with sort of James Brown mimicry. Yeah. So these shows are milestones, you could say, along that path. But David, you pointed out that there's no real establishment of who Phish was other than explaining where they played their first show and Mike's radio show answer. Yeah. Sort of talking about how they built up a fan base. So you wouldn't know that there was anything to change. You wouldn't know what, point A was, that they were currently, departing on their way to point B. The documentary doesn't have time for that. I'm not sure how you could squeeze that into an 80-minute movie, to be honest, but it doesn't even bother to try.
And it might not be interesting to non-Phish fans, but it would be a narrative arc. It would be something that you could describe. And so, it really is during this period from the Great When, especially through fall, and then even in those rehearsals ahead of the Island Tour. Island Tour is a flag in the ground moment for the Cowfunk era. And then into Europe, they are figuring out how to make this work, and they're playing, and there are, they're introducing new songs that are consistent with it, some of which are, top stuff from this time that we don't hear. Ghost, for instance, does not make an appearance in this movie. And and what's odd though, what's interesting, I do like the little clues that are sprinkled through the movie that do tell you that this change is going on, even if Todd Phillips is either unaware or not especially interested in it.
So yeah, all that is interesting, but it's sort of, we're talking about what's not in the movie. And so here's what I'm going to do. I feel both of you just like strongly desiring to tell this story, right? And so this is what I'm going to suggest. You guys are, Andy and Rob are the Peter Jackson. You get to go back and take this footage and, get backify it. If that is now, that's now a word. But if you're going to take what you think this footage might exist and what we've seen and what, probably was captured and put it together into a film that, would be compelling to a general audience, like, it could make it onto HBO or Netflix or something like that. What, describe that movie that you would like it to be.
Well, go ahead. So there's one talking head segment that is important to this moment, which is when Todd Phillips tells Trey that Brad Sands, the tour manager, thought that the previous night's show wasn't very good. And Trey is disgusted by it. Calls him, I think, like fucking mental patient, I think.
Yes.
And he says, I don't care. People don't come to hear us play every part exactly right.
Right, like every change.
Every change. And he says, did he say that because we missed a change? And he says, people don't come to hear every part. He says, people come for the energy. All I care about is the energy. I thought people were rocking last night. And I think you can frame the evolution that was going on through that quote, because the previous era was very proggy, is one way to describe it. They have a lot of these songs that have these really complex compositions that, frankly, when they play them now, Trey almost always misses some part of the composer section of these songs.
This is a lot of changes.
Yes, he misses a lot of changes these days, and around this time too. And in the 93 to 96 era, or I'll say that they didn't. They played foam perfectly every time in the early 90s. And when they come into Cowfunk, it changes. It's more relaxed, it's more dancey. And so Trey is articulating here an actual evolution in his thinking about music, I think, that we don't get anything more from. And I'm guessing that you could pull from this footage a before and after and around that quote.
Yeah, what I would really like to see, and maybe they just didn't have this organized or accessible at the time, is instead of sort of jumping in media res, as the movie does, you have a 10-minute montage of footage of the band going from playing, a dorm dance like they talk about, up through headlining Madison Square Garden for New Year's Eve 1995, and the Clifford Ball, which was the first big festival that Phish put together and brought together 60,000 people to an Air Force base in 1996. And then the structure of the movie is about when you're a band that has come from the very bottom to the very top, maybe not commercially, but you've put together the biggest concert that happened anywhere in the United States that year. What do you do next? That's the drama here. That's the narrative of this era of Phish. And you really dig into that rehearsal footage and try and figure out, how does a band move on once they've reached that peak? How do they overcome the comparisons to the Grateful Dead, which you have some conversations about, but, could go even farther. You really need the buy-in from the other members because the story here of how they survived is that they went from being a project that Trey was very much the leader of to being more of an equal partnership among the four of them. So you get the other ones to talk about, how did you step up and find your place so that it is a four-way conversation and not just following a dominant leader. And then you talk about, how they had to go to Europe and sort of break it back down to these smaller venues in order to figure out how to do this for the major venues. So they go back to Europe, they play small shows, they play a really, excellent fall tour where things start clicking. And then they do another big festival that is, the equal of size, if not bigger, of the Clifford Ball, the Grey Went, or Lemon Wheel if you want to bridge it over to 98. And it showed that there's this triumph where over just 2 years, this band has totally reinvented their sound and found new creative life that is going to sustain them going forward. So that's the story I would tell. Now, is that interesting to non-Phish fans? I don't know, but I do think there's kind of like, some kind of monster style story there where it's about band dynamics. Like, can a band change its dynamics from what it's been? Can a band move on from being at the top of its success and move it in a new direction and find new success? So that's even more fulfilling. I think you could probably do that, maybe not with the footage that he caught, but I think, it's at the right era to tell that story.
Well, I like that. I'm sure that Disney Plus is listening to this. So please, you've seen the success of Get Back. Contact Andy and Rob, and let's make that movie. That sounds really good. No, I in all seriousness, that is, as a not particularly a fan of the band, that sounds like a compelling movie that I would want to watch.
And so there is one other artifact in this movie that would work in that too, which is we hear at the Great Went a band conversation that's pretty tense, maybe even a band argument about what they seem to all think was a bad set, or certainly Trey thought was a bad set. And they're discussing what they did and what they didn't do and what they should have done. And the band instituted a rule shortly after that they would not talk about the sets that they just played. That rule persisted today. Phish doesn't talk about their shows to one another anymore.
It's like Fight Club.
I don't know, Rob. How would you describe it? What's your understanding of this?
Yeah,
this analysis rule.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe it's gotten a little bit looser these days, but definitely at the time, yeah. And I think you can hear why the rest of the band wanted that rule, because Trey, this is one of the Trey being a dick moments, is him, literally walking off the stage and telling them that they sucked at the biggest show of their year. Later on, he said, I think after the very next set, he's like, that was great. We did a really great job. And that's where the James Brown line comes up. But anyway, it's fascinating to hear that sort of bickering within the band. I totally agree. And what's cool about the Wentz being, if you still want to shuffle things around, is that image you talked about of them building this sculpture over the course of the weekend with the fans and then lighting it on fire is just a perfect symbol for what I'm talking about. Like, Phish had built this incredible body of work and found huge success over the first 12 years of their career. And part of how they renewed themselves is to burn down what they had done before. So you could even still use that footage. The other thing I'll say, if I was making this movie, is they were at the Great Went and they presumably shot the Went gin.
Release it. Release the Went gin.
One of the most famous performances among Phish fans. So I would have dedicated just 20 minutes of the movie to showing the entire Went gin, just to show you what a great Phish jam looks like, because you don't get that in this movie. You get some nice solos and no jamming.
Sorry, Dave, but I want to lean on this is that we do get almost a whole performance from Went, but it's character zero.
Yeah.
And we could listen to Bathtub Gin there. And so I will say that, the music that Todd Phillips seems to have zeroed in on, that he wanted to show, because there is a lot of music in this movie, relative to, is he seems to like the ballads and he seems to like the chomper anthems.
And the covers. He loves to show that Phish is a cover band, which I like. It shows that Phish is a great cover band.
I mean, you get the barbershop quartet piece where they're standing in front of the band, singing "Hello, My Baby, Hello, My Darling" like Michigan J. Frog, and it's really good. I mean, they harmonize really well.
Yeah, well, and so like you get a long performance of Waste, you get a long performance of Bittersweet Motel, and I like those songs. Some Phish fans don't, but they're certainly not songs that like people are aching to hear when they go to a show. Mm-hmm. And then he sort of plops you in at the peak of a Down with Disease. You get Wilson, you get Character Zero. So I don't know if he didn't know how to cinematically make like a real jam interesting. Mm-hmm. Which might be something that would be understandable if you actually had to tackle it. But you get a lot of music, and I don't think that this is the way I would try to get somebody to like the music of Phish, really.
See, I like the music in the movie more than I thought I would.
Okay, that's interesting.
So maybe it was a success from that perspective. Like if it's going for the casual, let me just say, like in terms of thinking about Phish, Rob, I would have to say that what kind of contextualized it for me is your 36 from the Vault co-host, Steve Hyden, who in his book, Twilight of the Gods, it's a book about classic rock, but then there's a chapter where he yanks the steering wheel hard to the left and talks about Phish and basically says like, well, if you're looking for classic rock and that kind of style and that kind of feeling in this day and age, Phish is it. Like they're doing what classic rock is. Yeah. And he goes, I'm not going to try to reproduce his argument off the dome here, but it did kind of make sense to me. So I was thinking about that a lot while I was watching this movie. And so maybe I would just say that like Todd Phillips, in his defense, focused on Phish's classic rock elements to appeal to that wider fan base or that wider base of music fans, more so than the pieces that would really tell the story of the uniqueness of the band that would appeal to, Andy and Rob.
Yeah. And what my favorite quotes from this movie this time around was Trey sort of ranting in his van about how they're not like the Grateful Dead. And his argument is, they didn't grow up in the 50s and 60s listening to old folk and blues records. They were suburban mall kids in the 70s who grew up listening to classic rock. And that's, what they're doing in the same way that the Dead were doing sort of the first half of 20th century American music. Phish is like a conduit for sort of this, 70s into early 80s period of American rock music, which is an argument that Steve has made as well. I think he makes it in that book. And I love it. I think that's a perfect encapsulation of what Phish is that they are just, classic rock taken to its extreme in a modern context. So you're right. I think that is a good argument for Phish, and probably a good argument to make in a movie that is trying to appeal to non-Phish people, in the same way that one of the best ways to get into Phish is to listen to their Halloween concerts, where they typically covered an entire album by another artist. And it was The Who, the Beatles, the Velvet Underground, the Talking Heads. Like they were covering classic rock into early 80s post-punk artists. And I know a lot of Phish fans who came to them through listening to Phish doing the White Album and then dug into the rest of their music, just because it's, hearing them play something and interpret something that you already know is a good gateway for this band.
Yeah. Rob, I played for David the Chula Vista Piper from this fall, and I'm happy to report he had to begrudgingly admit that he, quote, liked it an awful lot. So there you go.
Well, it's great to hear. I mean, and this is like the miracle of Phish, is that they're still today in 2021, 20 years after this movie came out, still making really fascinating, interesting, different music, which I just love about them. That's what, I mean, they're as vital today as they were at the time that this movie was shot, which is, that doesn't happen very often in music history, and we're lucky to have that. So I would really be interested. I don't know if you've seen it, Andrew. I have not watched Between Me and My Mind, which is the recent documentary about Phish, and it's mostly about Trey, I understand. It's
almost
also about them.
Yeah,
and it's also about them writing like a really terrible song. But I hear that it is kind of like the happy, what would you call it, the non-evil twin to this movie in some ways.
Yeah, it's certainly a bookend in that respect. It's a very sober Trey. I like it. I like it because I like Trey and I like Phish, and I'll take all the content I can get. I have seen it. I saw it in the theater, and I've seen it maybe 2 or 3 times since. But yeah, they spend a lot of time on Soul Planet. Not anyone's favorite Phish song. Although, boy, are the boys determined to make it everyone's favorite Phish song with the way they've decided to jam it this year, which is another funny thing that they do. Of course, they know that everybody makes fun of that song, and so they use it as the vehicle for rocking 30-minute jams every 5 or 6 shows these days. It's a very funny in-joke almost.
So another kind of interesting thing about this movie is that, with any documentary that's 20 years old, it's a portrait of its time. Just kind of the look and feel of it is different from what we get now. I mean, first of all, Andy and I have talked a lot over this, season about the evolution of rock docs from the, ones we've watched from the 90s to, more contemporary, for lack of a better word, slicker, more well-produced or more polished documentaries. And then just kind of the way people behave and, and just kind of look. I mean, I kind of feel like a lot of the knock on Phish fans is, or Phish and the fans, is the kind of dorkiness aspect of it. Mm-hmm. One of the fans in the movie is this guy who's like, well, just if you're a dork, embrace it. I mean, if dorks ruled the world, it would be a better place. I think 20 years on, that doesn't really seem to have panned out. But I do kind of find that the kind of, the non-rock star look that Phish and their fans were cultivating at the time, the kind of, just, sloppy t-shirt and whatever kind of look they had. I mean, it is sort of endearing looking back. It's sort of, it kind of seems like a portrait of a more innocent time, I would say.
One of the sort of Easter eggs, I guess, unintentionally probably, that I love about this movie is that you see Trey wearing the same shirt on stage, like 6 months apart, like at the Rochester show and then in Prague, in Europe. And if you notice that, it underscores how not, rock and roll flashy these guys are, right? They're just wearing the clothes they wore all day on stage.
He rags on the keyboard player Page for wearing a new shirt.
Page's new shirt, his song. Yeah, that is a great moment.
And
still often the fans.
I was just gonna say, you still often hear jokes on Phish tour about maybe they'll play Page's new shirt tonight.
And Page has some wild shirts now, so
yes, that's true.
They definitely could bust that out. The fan stuff, I like it. It was also what really made Phish fans angry when this came out.
I think that's the thing that Phish fans really dislike about this movie.
Yeah. Particularly the shirtless bros at the Wentz, I think. Yeah. Which is a great scene. And this is why I think there's a really good Todd Phillips movie here where he just spent the whole time on the lot. And it was like, Phish was almost like, what's the band they're going to see in Dazed and Confused? Are they going to see Aerosmith?
Aerosmith.
Yeah, so it's almost like you're making Dazed and Confused, but about the Phish lot scene, and you never even show Phish or talk to Phish. It's just about everything that is happening in the orbit of a Phish concert. I think there's a
heavy metal parking lot, but for Phish.
Essentially, yeah. So I think there's a great either documentary or movie there that Todd Phillips would be the perfect guy to make. But
I'll say every time I hear the very quiet section in Golgi Apparatus, I immediately am transported to the lot scene outside of Rochester where they talk to the girl wearing the fairy wings looking for a miracle. That is like that scene. I have such a strong association with the music they play over that's what I think of now when they play that song.
Yeah, and I like the guy who looks like he must be stoned out of his mind in Europe, but talks about how he likes to go see them sober because it kind of undercuts expectations. as hilarious as the shirtless bros in the tent are shotgunning Keystone or whatever they're doing and talking about armpit hair, it is an accurate portrayal of what the Phish scene was like, because it wasn't all, hippie people. There were a lot of frat guys at Phish shows. There were a lot of, just bros.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch this so closely with Woodstock 99, which we've also discussed, because it's almost contemporaneous. And, I was texting with Andy, that these like shirtless dudes outside in a tent at the Phish festival, you could teleport those guys to Woodstock 99 and they would be, I'm not saying these particular people, but somebody of their ilk could be, easily seen in the mayhem and horror of Woodstock 99. It just happened to be that, that Phish had a little bit more of a chill vibe.
So I had remembered that scene as them saying a bunch of like really embarrassing stuff. But I almost found them kind of sweet this time in a strange way. Like they weren't as like meat-headed as I thought, as my memory had them. They're talking about how it is like a chill scene and nobody's fighting. And maybe you meet a girl and hit it off, but they're not like talking about, assaulting people. Like they're pretty chill bros actually. And so I think, it jumped out at me. I don't really like the male gazy, like stuff with the girl sucking nitrous balloons. And I mean, the nude photo shoot is what it is. Like that happened. And of course you're going to put that in a movie if you have.
Right. There's just to set the scene. I mean, they announce at this Phish festival, they have like, I guess their own radio, a radio channel, and their DJ just says, hey, we're doing this nude photo shoot and inviting anybody who wants to be nude, men, women, whoever, to show up at this certain spot and time and take this giant photo. And just, you see this crowd of nude people showing up to take this picture. I guess it's compelling as part of the documentary, I guess, but it didn't lead anywhere. And, I don't necessarily know that it's exploitative. It just was kind of like, all right, well, what is this showing? Just people sometimes are naked.
Yeah, there's just like a bunch of moments where like, it's like Todd Phillips is kind of just like taken by how wacky the scene is. It's like, haha, they've planned a Spencer Tunick mass nudity photo shoot here because, boy, they're just doing one of everything on this tour.
It's again. Again, I think we're all kind of converging on an agreed position that regardless of whether or not you're a big fan of this band, the movie leaves a little bit to be desired.
Well, there's something in here though that I think is important, and it's kind of it's like a moment in this movie that has loomed large within Phish fandom for a while, which is when Todd Phillips brings terrible reviews and and has Trey read them on screen, and so he reads a review that basically the guy says that Phish at this point has inherited the mantle from the dead, which allows them to on certain nights urinate in the ears of their listeners, and that people, the crowds will be there happily lapping it up and with tape recorders to capture the moment. And then Trey is sort of just asked to respond to that. And, I am still struck by it because, for one, it's such an interesting moment where Trey is just like always expected to answer for why people like what he's doing in a way that I don't think other popular artists are asked to do quite so much. You don't usually have to justify yourself. It's usually seems to be okay that some people like what you do and some people don't like what you do if you have some success.
Right. Nobody's like Billie Eilish. Why do people like your terrible music?
Yeah. Right. And this is like, it's almost natural that Trey would be expected to answer for this here. So I don't know, Rob, maybe you have some thoughts on that. The other thing is, I listened to an interview with Ezra Koenig from Vampire Weekend with the lyricist for Phish, Tom Marshall. And he actually talked about that moment where he said that he just felt like such a kinship with Trey at the time that it seems like him having to answer for whether they are or aren't like the dead and why people like them so much seems like he's constantly being graded on the rules of a game that he didn't agree to play. Mm-hmm. And that and that he's constantly just sitting there going like, why? Like, I didn't say any of this. I didn't set any of these terms. Why am I constantly having to answer for these terms?
Yeah, absolutely. One funny thing about that is that I was at the show that review is describing.
Yeah, it's Deer Creek, Deer Creek, right?
It's 8/10/97. Actually, a really great Phish show. So I guess the guy was right that I was lapping it up. But you can see why he would write it about that show, because there are some extremely self-indulgence.
So I looked it up. I looked it up on Fishnet just to see how people responded to it. And well, it's a highly rated show. It's like a 4.5, which in Phish terms is good. But there's also a quite lengthy debate in the reviews about whether it's good or terrible.
Yeah.
And so what? There was like they did a rotation jam. They played each other's instruments.
Yeah. So first of all, the first set is amazing. It's a rare show where the first set is better than the second set. Yeah. The second set has, as you say, like a very long rotation jam where they're playing each other's instruments not particularly well. Has a song that called Rocco William that is where they are all playing the wrong instruments and is a pretty terrible song. And then it has a David Bowie with maybe the longest intro to a David Bowie ever, where I'm pretty sure Trey is just mad at Fishman and making him play the hi-hat for like 8 minutes straight. So, like I said, some really self-indulgent moments, but a show that I love, like one of my favorite shows I ever saw back in that era. So I don't know. I think, in the version of this movie that I talked about earlier, maybe you can use that as a point to sort of get at this, tension between Phish achieving success on their own level, independent of sort of the standard structure of the music industry. So like critics didn't really like them. They still don't really like them. It's come around a little bit, but not really. Almost everything written about Phish just compared them to the Dead in a really lazy way, or talked about how their fans were a bunch of drugged out hippies and just wanted to dance and didn't care about the music. So you could use that as sort of a plot point to be like, Phish doesn't care about that. Like they're doing their own thing. I don't know if in the context of this movie, it really accomplishes much beyond just introducing some drama to a movie that doesn't have a ton of drama in terms of how it unfolds. So it's a scene that I like, and I like the quotable lines that come out of it, but I'm not sure that it is really functioning, effectively in context here.
So I'm going to propose. So, Andy, one thing that Andy and I often do in these podcasts is discuss, heroes and villains. Some of the villains in our previous episodes have, in our Tina Turner episode, of course, Ike Turner is a villain. In the Woodstock 99 episode, John Scher, who is, the promoter of Woodstock 99, clearly villain. I'm going to propose that the villain of this movie is Todd Phillips. Because I think just, if you watch this movie, there's nobody who's going to like the Todd Phillips aspect, whether you're a Phish fan or not. He's not bringing it.
Yeah, or I was going to say it's Brad Sands for cutting off people's heads and photos in Europe.
Okay, yeah.
Or telling the band to go on stage. No, I think you're right.
Get some beer can thrown at him, Brad, and be like, say it's time to go on stage.
Yeah, he's doing a job.
I know, poor Brad. He really takes a beating. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think Todd Phillips you also see him a lot, which I thought was really interesting. I don't think I noticed this when I watched it 20 years ago because I had no idea what the dude looked like. But he's kind of doing the Scorsese thing of like being on camera a lot, like asking the questions. And I don't know. I mean, I feel for the guy. Like Phish is such a complicated thing to try and explain. I was on another podcast called Bandsplain where they asked me to kind of like summarize Phish for people who had never heard them, and it is incredibly hard to do accurately and in a way that doesn't make you sound like just an insane person. Like everything I said out loud, I was like, oh my god, Like, how would anybody think this is good the way I'm describing this, even though I could not be a bigger fan of this band? So I sympathize with Todd Phillips here, especially as a non-fan diving into this world with a lot of expectations and just trying to do the best he could on what I think was a pretty limited budget too. That, you know, that's why there's only these 4 shows basically that they cover. And, you know, not a lot of coverage of in the live footage. Even he talked in an interview I saw about how he only had 1 camera to film those things. So, yeah, you know, I think I understand why they picked him, but I also think he was maybe not exactly the right choice here. So, you know, maybe a villain, but a sympathetic villain.
So in the interview, I was surprised. He said that he really like loved hanging out with the guys and thought they were so fun, and that it was like, he like looks back on touring with them so fondly, and that him and Trey kept up for a while, and that he considered Trey a friend, and that he was like, he liked all the people at the show, and thought that he, to your point about the sort of through line through his career about being, you know, documenting a certain type of hedonistic person, that he just like understood these people as soon as he saw them out in the crowd. It made perfect sense to them, and that they were a lot of people who were living their life and having fun. So it's funny. It comes across as critical when I watch the movie, but then I hear him talk about it, and he doesn't seem to mean it that way. He seems to think that Trey is awesome, that everybody who's going to these shows is awesome, that everybody is a cool dude, and they're just having a rocking time. Which, you know, I agree with all of those things. I just thought he didn't. You know? So
I would say in the movie that just because of the way it is, I as an, you know, again, not really a fan. I wouldn't say that any of the members of the band in the interview segments or the offstage segments come off as particularly charismatic. I mean, to me, they were not jumping off the screen the way that some people do in documentaries, where you're like, give me more of that. Like, that person is incredible. Like, I'm falling in love with this person as I'm watching it. Like, I didn't get that. Do you think that these people are charismatic in some way? Like, they could be in another documentary and come across as appealing or charming, or that's just kind of who they are, and their personality comes across through the music, and they're really just not suited for, you know, for grabbing the screen in a documentary?
Yeah, I think it's option B. I don't think Phish is charismatic at all. I think they're really boring to watch on stage if they didn't have a big light show and we're playing amazing music. And that's where like the live footage is kind of handicapped from the start. Like, you see Trey make a lot of funny faces. And that's about all the stage theatrics you get from Phish. And popping balloons, I guess, is as exciting as it gets on stage. Phish have always been boring. I mean, all about the music on stage. Like, they jump on trampolines during one song, and that's, you know, they have some dance routines, but it's all like stuff to like get around the fact that, you know, they're not, you know, naturally, not natural performers, I guess, in sort of the traditional, you know, rock and roll sense. I think they talk about music in a very interesting way. I think, you know, Trey makes for a good podcast interview when they get him on podcasts. I've talked to Mike. I've interviewed Mike before, and he's a fascinating guy to talk to, and very thoughtful, and thinks a lot about the band and his role in the band and the history of the band. But for a movie documentary, I don't know. I mean, like I was thinking about, I thought the Long Strange Trip Grateful Dead movie from a few years ago now that Justin Kreutzmann made,
yes,
was excellent. It was also 5 hours long.
Not long enough, not quite long enough.
I mean, it needed to be at least that long to cover everything about the Grateful Dead. But did a great job of covering not just the band, but everything around the band, right? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about whether something like that will ever be possible with Phish. And it could be in the right hands, but I also, in some ways, do not think that Phish makes for a good cinematic story in a way, the same way that the Dead did. So yet another comparison of the Dead to Phish. Sorry, Trey, but it's another place where maybe they don't quite measure up.
In terms of how like charismatic they are, or how compelling they are as movie characters, it's a weird thing where like it's sort of like the Phish sense of humor, which doesn't translate to non-Phish fans. You know, like the sort of in jokes that they do, or the gags that they do for New Year's, or stuff that they've been doing on Halloween lately since they stopped doing covers of other people's music. Like, I try to explain that to my wife, and she's just like, yeah, where's the joke? You seem to be so amused by this, and you've yet to explain the thing that is humorous. And that it's kind of that way with them as characters too. Like, it's fascinating to me to watch anything about them interacting, or them talking about their dynamics or what they're doing. But like, that's just because I'm bought into the narrative. Like, I'm so many years into this and so invested that any little crumb I can get about their story is like, oh, okay, that is fascinating. Okay. But I don't expect anybody else to feel that way at all, really.
Sort of like the humor from another beloved Todd Phillips character, the Joker.
Right.
Which all turned out so well. Also, like to point guns at people. Kind of a, maybe it was all based on Trey.
Yeah, when Trey is reading the bad reviews, that is his I must become the Joker moment in this movie.
All right. Well, I think we're coming to the end of the first set here. So, Rob, the question we always ask at the end, which this is not going to be a surprise here, is, if you're, would you recommend this movie just as a movie, as a fun watch to somebody who's not already particularly a fan or knows a lot about this band? Rob, I'm going to throw that one first to you, and then Andy, you can jump in.
Yeah, I was ready for this question, and I was going to say no, but you may have swayed me a little bit by saying that, you as someone who isn't deeply invested in Phish actually did find the music parts somewhat enticing, I guess. So I think maybe
I was warmer than that.
Yeah, it was a hard no before we had this conversation, and now I think maybe it's a soft no, where it might work as sort of like a light introduction to the music of the band, even if it's not quite capturing it in the way that I would like. But again, yeah, different standards from my perspective versus somebody coming totally new to the band.
So my answer is yes, actually. I don't know if this comes across, but I seem to like the movie more than you guys do. I think while I would like a more serious treatment, I think that the novelty that Todd Phillips sees the whole thing through is probably something that a lot of people could get on board with. Even if you're not, you're not seeing a well-crafted arc here. You're pretty well taken care of with like funny little moments, interesting little moments. Every 5 or 6 minutes, you're introduced to something new that's funny or interesting. And yes, David, your revelation that you thought the music was good, I think is a relevant point too. I used to, when I was listening to the podcast Analyze Phish, I used to always think that Harris should play Scott this movie, and that should have been an episode, like a commentary track or something. And so, yeah, I think the answer for me is yes. I think this is an easy watch that you could put on and do something else passively, and or watch the movie passively and come away with pretty amused. I think it's a funny movie.
I'm coming in with a strong no on this one. I'm not necessarily in the habit of dunking on rock docs, and maybe I find Todd Phillips to be an easy target. Sure, he's a lovely person, and I wish him all the best. And everybody else involved with this film, I'm sure they worked hard and tried their best. But I did not. I mean, I've watched it twice for the purpose of watching this, for doing this podcast. I don't anticipate watching this movie again in my natural lifetime. Because I just think that it doesn't take me on any kind of journey. There are things about it that are interesting or fine. Some of the music parts I think are okay or pretty good, or even I enjoyed. Again, not trying to bag on the band. It's not their fault that the movie didn't necessarily turn out the way maybe they envisioned it. But I just feel like It doesn't hang together as a movie. The parts don't add up to a whole. And I feel like the band was not particularly well served by this movie. And I would, if there is a better documentary about Phish or another one, which apparently there is, I wasn't even aware of that. I would take a swing at that one day, and maybe Rob will have you on for a good one, because I don't know, man. This was a tough hang for me.
I mean, you alluded to it earlier and we didn't really dig into it, but it is interesting that the band doesn't seem to like this movie, and it's very out of print. You can find it easily on YouTube. That's what I ended up watching.
Right.
But Phish, which has, its own streaming service, they could easily put this movie up if they wanted to have kind of memory hold it. So that says, I think, supports your point that the band doesn't feel like they were totally well served by it. The other thing is that, as I said, when it came out, part of the novelty was having live pro shot footage of the band in concert. Well, now a big part of the Phish experience is everybody watching Phish shows webcast live in 4K HD at home every night of tour. So that's another place where I think this movie has kind of diminished in terms of its import, is that if you want to watch great footage of great Phish shows, you have hundreds, if not thousands of hours available at the click of a button. So there's a lot of Phish shows that I would probably show somebody before I showed them this movie, because a great Phish show takes you on a journey, takes you on a narrative voyage, more so than I think this movie does.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. I mean, this clearly is a band that cares about the journey and the narrative of a show, even though it's, to some extent improvised. It matters to them that when, from the beginning to the end, somebody has an experience and there's some kind of arc to it. That's the sense I get from them. So again, I think you're right on, Rob. Maybe a good show would be a way better way to introduce somebody to the band.
Yeah.
Well, if you enjoy things that are good, you can check out Rob's podcast, 36 from the Vault, because that is very good. And your other writing and elsewhere. Is there something else you'd like to plug or direct people to, Rob?
I will just say, if you are a Phish fan or a Phish curious, I do have a project where I write about every Phish show on its 25th anniversary. And we are about to get into this exact period that Todd Phillips covered. Next year will be the 25th anniversary of 1997. So I have a Substack, phishcrit.substack.com, where you can subscribe to get those essays dropped into your email box, or just read it, at your own leisurely pace. And I think a lot about the narrative of the band. And so a lot of the things I've said here are going to be coming out in that essay project over the next year.
Well, thanks a lot. And thanks to everyone who's listened to, this is the end of season 1 of Rock Docs. There will be more coming soon. Andy, you have anything to say to conclude this epic season of Rock Docs?
Rob, do you like Goose?
I have not quite connected with Goose yet. I like them in theory, but have not caught the bug yet.
All right. That's all I got. That's what I'd like to be the last part of the season. we were perilously close to getting out of this season without mentioning Goose, so we had to do something about it.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Rob, and thanks to everybody for listening to Rock Docs.